Good evening. Thank you very much, President Shapiro, CEO David Harris, and ACJ's Rome representative, Lisa Palmieri-Billing, for giving me this opportunity to bring you a message from Rome, a city that has a very long history of connection with the Jewry. Minister of Foreign Affairs, Angelino Alfano, who cannot be here tonight, has asked me to convey his heartfelt message and also his regret for not being able to be with you tonight. He also asked me to pay tribute to the AJC and the values it stands for, fighting against human rights violation, xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of extremism. And we have been listening during the very interesting panel that these very sentiments, unfortunately, are still very lively and vivid in Europe these days. And these are the same principles that shape Italy's vision of a world without indifference, intolerance, and discrimination. Italy is committed to the Middle East peace process towards objectives of two states, Israel and Palestine, living in peace and security with agreed common borders. And we wish you well to President Trump revamping this project. Dear Mr. Harris, thank you for your kind reference to Italy's courageous stance at UNESCO. Italy, being the largest site for UNESCO projects, understands very well that our vote in May was meant to reject attempts to turn UNESCO into a political and ideological battlefield targeting the State of Israel. We will stand up against an initiative which tries to isolate Israel or refute the history of Jerusalem. So on behalf of my government and my own behalf, I wish you a very successful AJC Global Forum and express my best regards and next year in Jerusalem.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome AJC CEO David Harris.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. First of all, allow me to thank the Italian ambassador for conveying the message of Foreign Minister Alfano. And I want to be sure that all of you understand exactly what Italy did just a few weeks ago at UNESCO. It stood up to intense pressure from a number of European countries that did not want Italy to break ranks. But Italy, on principle, and with courage, broke ranks. And once it did, others followed. And we owe Italy a debt of gratitude, which I hope we can express next year to Minister Alfano in Jerusalem. But I have to say, in full disclosure, some of you know this, I have a very soft spot for Italy to begin with. For those of you who are not in on the inside reference, in 1975, I moved to Rome. I worked with thousands of Jews and others who managed to escape from behind the Iron Curtain, and for whom Rome was a point of transit and application for countries of resettlement. And during my years in Rome, two things happened. I fell in love with Italy, and I fell in love in Italy. And the result of that Cary Grant, Audrey Hepburn-like story is my wife, Giulietta, proud citizen of Italy, and our 3 children, also proud citizens of Italy as well as the United States. And just one more word on Italy. A former Italian ambassador, Cesare Pasquinelli, was the ambassador of Italy to Libya in 1967 during the Six-Day War. And it was because of his actions in trying to help protect Jews who were in danger that many Jews' lives were saved. Without his actions and the efforts of other Italian diplomats, I'm not sure who, including my wife's family, might be here today. So a big thank you to the ambassador to Italy for so many things. I'm so pleased and proud that in back-to-back years we have been honored to host first National Security Advisor Ambassador Susan Rice, representing the Obama administration, and you'll recall that she spoke to us from this stage almost exactly a year ago to the day. And today we had the honor of hosting General McMaster, the National Security Advisor for the Trump administration. And for me, this speaks above all to the fact that we who remain fiercely, insistently, stubbornly nonpartisan, independent, open-minded, and centrist are eager and determined to engage with each administration to find all those possible areas for cooperation and collaboration. That's AJC in a nutshell. In a world that has become so dangerously divided, our country, which is in some respects becoming 2 countries within one, our thinking, which has become so binary, if you're not with me, you're against me. Our customized ecosystems within which we live and which validate and reinforce those things that we're predisposed to believe. AJC goes against the grain. We're interested in issues, not individuals, in policies, not parties. We understand that the challenges we face globally are of such a complex nature, we need to open our minds, our ears, our eyes, and our hearts in order to better understand how we can move them forward. And that's the spirit in which we received Susan Rice last year and General McMaster this year. As many of you know, in the coming 2 days, we mark 3 important anniversaries that have relevance to this day. General McMaster referred to the first anniversary, the 50th anniversary tomorrow of the outbreak of what came to be known as the Six-Day War. And it seems to me that at this moment in time, it's important to revisit that history because much of it is as relevant today as it was then. But sadly, one has to be well into one's 60s to have understood at the time what took place. And of course, most people on the planet, most people in this country are younger. So all they see is the outcome of the war without understanding how it came about. Yet without that understanding, how can we truly understand what is the situation? Let me offer a few illustrations of what I mean, that I think all of us need to keep in mind and bring back to our respective countries. It wasn't as if Israel one day brazenly chose to, quote, occupy someone else's land. Rather, as the general said, Israel faced the prospect of annihilation. This is not in the realm of alternative facts or post-truth realities or postmodernism. These are demonstrable facts, as the general said. The goal of Egypt and Syria, as expressed repeatedly in these days, was the complete and total annihilation of the Jewish state, and nothing less. Israel, therefore, fought preemptively to prevent that from happening, and thankfully it succeeded. But let's remember, there were no fixed borders on the West Bank. There were only armistice lines that derived from the previous War of Independence and a resolution which the Arab world rejected when Israel offered its outstretched hand of peace. Let's remember something else, that the West Bank and the eastern part of Jerusalem and Gaza were not in Israeli hands. Had Egypt and Jordan and the Arab world wished to create a Palestinian state with eastern Jerusalem as its capital, they could have done so any day of the week until June 5th, 1967. And there is nothing, and there is no one who could have stopped them. Examine the historical records and archives, as I have tried to do, to look for any evidence, even a scintilla, that suggests there was an interest in creating a Palestinian state before Israel entered the West Bank in that war of self-defense. I've not found it, and I haven't met the person yet who has. So let's remember that this interest in a Palestinian state seems to have occurred only after Israel replaced Jordan and Egypt in the West Bank and in Gaza. And let's also remember something else, that after the war concluded, Israel, through various third-party channels, sought to exchange the acquired land for peace with the Arab world. Israel's principal interest was in retaining the old city. The rest was negotiable. The Arab response to that Israeli offer for land for peace came on September 1st, 1967 in Khartoum, Sudan, when the Arab League meeting to consider the Israeli proposal came up with its now legendary response: no negotiations, no peace, and no recognition. And for that enormous mistake that they made, they are still paying a price. And there's one other outcome of that war which we need to remind ourselves of as well. And it circles back, if you will, to Cesare Pasquinelli and to my wife Giulietta. Until 1967, there was a Jewish community in Libya. To be sure, it was a small one of just a few thousand. In its peak in 1948, it was up to 40 or more thousand Jews. By 1967, most had left, fearful of Libyan independence and what it would mean, attracted by the creation of the Jewish state. But they stayed, hopeful that somehow the guarantees in the Libyan Constitution of 1951 would prevail. They were wrong. And within a few weeks of the Six-Day War, there was not a single Jew left in Libya. Not one. After 2,000 years of a Jewish presence in Libya, not a single Jew was left. The country had become Judenrein. Like so many other Arab countries that had once celebrated diversity and been home to ancient Jewish communities and witnessed either murder or death or forced exile. There was, in other words, a second refugee population from the Arab-Israeli wars, and yet the world has neglected it. Maybe it's because we didn't instrumentalize the refugees from the Arab world. They were resettled in Israel, in Italy, in France, in the United States, in Brazil, and elsewhere. Maybe had they been kept in camps ad infinitum, with a UN definition that described Palestinians as refugees for eternity, from generation to generation, and had that been applied to the Jews, maybe we'd be in a different situation. We need to use the 50th anniversary to speak up, to teach, to remind, to enlighten, to open people's minds, which sometimes, I fear, are closed. Tomorrow marks exactly 50 years as well, 70 years to the day that George Marshall, another legendary military figure of the United States, the person that Harry Truman was said to admire more than any other living American, traveled to Harvard University and delivered that famous speech, which has come to be known as the introduction to the Marshall Plan. Why is that important 70 years later? Because what it showed was American vision. It showed American courage. It showed American character. It showed American leadership. We understood that after the calamity of the Second World War, it was not only in the interests of European countries devastated by the calamity, but it was in American political, economic, diplomatic, and strategic interests to help rebuild Europe, and we knew it couldn't be done on a dime. It would take a massive effort over many years, but we applaud the vision of President Truman and Secretary Marshall and the American people that stood behind this and spoke to America's highest values and interests. That's why remembering the Marshall speech at Harvard and what it ushered in is so important today. And then, of course, the day after Tuesday, we marked the anniversary of D-Day. Last year, we had a moving ceremony on this stage, and Howard Gilbert of Chicago, one of the heroic veterans of the Second World War and a longtime leader of AJC, came here and he spoke. But that too, D-Day, the reminder that America projected its power and strength for the force of good against the maniacal force of evil, is something we need to remember today when people have questions and doubts about who we are as a nation, what we stand for, and what our role in the world needs to be. It needs to be one of vision, as Marshall demonstrated. It needs to be one of courage, as our troops on Omaha Beach demonstrated. It needs to be one of international engagement. It needs to be one of recognition that when America steps back, when America blinks, when America is distracted, the world doesn't wait for us to get it right. Instead, vacuums are created. And into those vacuums, as history has amply shown, dangerous actors can too quickly step. And you know and we know there are dangerous actors today who are stepping into perceived or real vacuums as they see them, testing the resolve of the democratic world, testing the resolve of alliances, testing the resolve of the United States. We need to keep these lessons in mind. And that's why, during what has been a very difficult period for our country, particularly difficult period of the last 2 years, in which we have found families too often divided, in which we have found workspaces too often challenged by politics, in which some families have even made ground rules about Thanksgiving and Passover dinners in order to avoid tension in the room. Let it be over who gets the dark or white meat from the turkey, and leave it at that. But in that climate, AJC from the beginning said, we're nonpartisan, but we have three core values that we are going to stand up for and defend as smartly, as thoughtfully, as steadfastly as we possibly can. Core value number one, we believe in democracy, we believe in the rule of law, and we believe in pluralism. If I could, I would discard the word tolerance from the English language. We're not about tolerance. We don't want to tolerate others, nor do we want to be tolerated. Rather, we set the bar a little higher. We seek mutual respect. We seek mutual understanding. We seek more moments like we experienced at the very beginning when a rabbi and an imam not only shared the podium, they shared a prayer and they shared a hope. That's what we need. The same organization that went to Millen, Georgia, in order to help rebuild the Gaze Hill Baptist Church, a largely African-American house of worship that was burned down in an act of arson. The same organization that responded quickly to our Greek Orthodox friends after their church was one of the victims of 9/11. The same organization that traveled to the Balkans after Slobodan Milosevic embarked on his ethnic cleansing from Kosovo, driving out hundreds of thousands of Muslims, and that then went to Germany and partnered with our German friends to bring relief and assistance to those Muslim refugees. The same organization will continue to be animated by the same values that speak to those humanitarian efforts. We stand with all people of goodwill, and we always shall. Number two, as I mentioned earlier, we believe in America's international engagement, nay, in America's leadership. We fully understand that America cannot be everywhere at all times, and that America cannot be the policeman of the world. We get that. We know that. And we also know that America is capable of mistakes, and when you're the big fellow on the block and you make a mistake, it's pretty noticeable. But at the same time, we also know that without America, our world, Israel, the Jewish people, all who aspire to democratic values and the protection of human dignity will be diminished. We can't do it without America. We need America strong and proud in both its hard power and its soft power, in its ability to engage the world and steer it in the right direction. And our third value, we stand by Israel. We stand by Israel not because we particularly like or dislike a given government or leader or decision, but because there's something much more fundamental in our connection to Israel. Call it, if you will, metaphysical. We understand that this sole majority Jewish nation in the world, which has not known a day of full and true peace for 69 years, needs and deserves our support. Yes, as David Gregory said, we have issues like religious pluralism. They're real issues. But we need to be able to compartmentalize and understand that we cannot hold Israel hostage while it resolves domestic issues, and withhold our support for its very right to exist, and its very right to defend itself, and for its very right to protect its historical integrity, and not allow member states of UNESCO to deprive us in front of our eyes of our very history, of our connection to Jerusalem, because if they do, they deny the Christian connection as well. There are no two ways about it. Is there any Christian history in Israel and in Jerusalem without Jewish history in Israel and Jerusalem? So we're going to stand by Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship and Israel's place in the world and our engagement with some 115 countries annually in order to try and make that case. And the last two things that I wish to say in this opening session of this remarkable global forum is, number one, I learned a profound lesson in 1973, 6 years after the Six-Day War. Many in Israel and around the world were quite confident, perhaps even cocky, about Israel's security. And then, of course, we know what happened in the early days of October 73. To my own surprise, I called the Israeli consulate in New York, and I volunteered for the IDF. And with all due modesty, I want to say here today that I take some responsibility for Israel's victory in the Yom Kippur War. And the reason is very simple. They rejected me. I was a sole surviving son, and even in that dire period of Israel's life, they would not accept a sole surviving son. But I learned something else, and it's every bit as applicable today in June of 2017. It all came down to one man in the Oval Office, Richard Nixon. Would Richard Nixon agree to provide spare parts to the state of Israel, which was fighting a war which its policy planning people could not have foreseen, much less its length? It was all up to Richard Nixon. How many American Jews voted for Richard Nixon? How many American Jews admired Richard Nixon? I think you know the answer, not too many. But the lesson I learned for advocacy was, if you're really going to be an advocate for the Jewish people and our interests, including the relationship with Israel, then you better have good relations with whoever occupies the White House and whoever sits in power in Congress. Have your own partisan views, we all do, but leave them at the doorstep. Because in that moment, it didn't come down to whether we liked Richard Nixon or not, or what we thought of Henry Kissinger or not. It came down to how they would decide a life and death decision for the state of Israel. And that's where I learned my advocacy lesson. And the second and final point is I learned another lesson in life. Never, ever, ever give up hope. Who would have foreseen 10 years after the Six-Day War, 6 years after the Yom Kippur War, and 2 years after Anwar Sadat, former chief of staff of the Egyptian military, anti-Semite, with pro-Hitler sympathies during the Second World War, we're told, would have gone to Jerusalem in 77, and by 1979 there would be a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt that has endured for 38 years. We are not giving up hope. And 15 years later, in 1994, King Hussein of blessed memory signed a peace treaty with Jordan, And for the last 23 years, through thick and thin, that peace treaty has survived. AJC will work 24/7 to defend Jewish interests, the Jewish people, the State of Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and we will work 24/7 to look for new opportunities, new hope, new King Hussein's, new Anwar Sadat's, because at the end of the day, the purpose of this exercise was best captured by Isaiah. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev, lo yilmadu od milchama. A nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor shall they learn war anymore. We will continue, as always, in our 111th year, to be seekers of peace. Enjoy the Global Forum, and see you next year in Jerusalem as well.